Hello, and welcome to The Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. I'd like to welcome you. Andrej is a very close friend of mine. He now exists in a number of chat groups, as I've been saying to people.
That's how you evaluate friends, depending on how many chats.
We millennials, we congregate online, right? And But part of the deep comradeship, people have family chat groups, people have friend chat groups, people have topic-based chat groups, and I think it's an underestimated form of bonding that really becomes quite meaningful in a world of disconnected people who don't have the same kind of communities that maybe we once did. So Andrej is a participant in two of the chat groups that I frequent. He has 2 master's degrees and a law degree. He is a practicing lawyer as well as a public servant in Her Majesty's government.
Much to your disdain.
much to my chagrin. But I wanted to have you on this because you and I have been talking about the future of Canada for many years now. And I think you have some ideas that are definitely worth sharing with our audience and some ideas of what Canada could be that I think could be inspiring to people. So I'll start with the first question, which is, why do you love this country? Why do you love Canada?
Before I can answer that, I need to give some exposition to why I'm in Canada in the first place.
Yes.
I'm in Canada because the country I was born in no longer exists.
It's true.
My parents fled the country they were born in. My grandparents had to flee within the country they were born in due to Civil War and World War II. And my great-grandparents also had to flee their respective countries. So I'm in Canada because of 4 generations of people having to flee the place they were born in because of Civil War or World War I, World War II, or other conflicts. So one of the reasons I really love Canada is its history, going back even to the French explorers and the British explorers that were first here, was always about a land where it doesn't matter where you're from, what baggage you brought with you. Here's a place where we're trying to build a new identity around a civic framework, an idea of a country. You go back to Sir John A., and for all his faults, he had this fantastic idea, not just him, the other founding fathers of Confederation around him, this idea that it doesn't matter if you're British or French or Indigenous or the many other nationalities, Polish, Ukrainian, Irish, German, whatever, that you bring whatever it is that culture is here and you insert it into this civic framework, this idea that our identity is around a political arrangement of institutions. Yes, it's this Judeo-Christian Western liberal tradition, but in its inception, it isn't about any one particular ethnicity, any one particular political ideology or religion or anything like that. It's this recognition that we're all disparate peoples from all different corners of the world, and those corners of the world have continued to expand throughout history, where it's no longer just refugees and individuals from war-torn countries coming from Europe. Now it's also from the Middle East, from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from the rest of Asia, from Latin America. And we're all able to get together and cooperate and collaborate and produce a more prosperous nation because we recognize that here it's not about where we came from. We bring that to the table. We leverage it. We bring the best of where we were, but we also recognize that we're here because something wasn't working back home.
I love that. I think that's something we don't talk about enough as the Canadian, let's say, intelligentsia is. People come here because they want to be here.
Well, that's exactly it.
And they're fleeing places that aren't as good to be. So
Canada's a tough place to get to.
Yeah.
Unless you're on the U.S. border, it takes a lot of effort, whether you're a refugee or an economic immigrant or you're just being sponsored. It's a heck of a far ways away.
Yeah,
and a lot of logistics goes into getting
and it gets cold here, right?
Yeah.
Like there's feet of snow in Saskatchewan right now.
If Canada was Puerto Rico and located in the middle of Europe, I would understand if everyone wants to come here. But there's a lot of factors. For example, when my family was looking for a place to immigrate from the former Yugoslavia, we were considering New Zealand. And one of the main reasons we decided against that was, well, it's so far away. How could we ever, if we even get to a place where we can afford flights again, it's going to take so long to get back and visit family. So that's one of the reasons why we chose Canada. Like, it's far, but it's not
Yeah, it's
New
not
Zealand
that.
far.
I had the pleasure of attending your wedding in Serbia. So you got to, and you married a girl from there as well, Anna, who's a lovely lady. And your wedding was so wonderful to have to be able to go back there and to kind of like stake your flag and say, this is where we're from, but this isn't who we are anymore.
Yeah, if you remember, we had a Canadian flag and a Serbian flag.
I got to be the bearer of that Canadian flag. So a moment of pride for me, national pride. Anyway, so part of why you're here is because it wasn't working where you came from.
No, the country was devastated.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. War
doesn't exist anymore.
Doesn't exist anymore. What do you love about this place now that you're here?
Well, so building on what I was saying, my parents came here with absolutely nothing. We came here as economic immigrants. We didn't qualify as refugees. So we came here with like 1 cent above the minimum amount you needed to have in order to qualify as an economic migrant. My dad was a professional engineer. Doesn't matter here. My mom was a lawyer. Doesn't matter over here. She wasn't able to restart her career because she's got 2 young kids. My brother and I were 2 and 6 years respectively. She needs to take care of them. And it costs thousands of dollars to get a law degree, and you got to go to school. So my dad was the primary breadwinner. He was eventually able to get his certification back and recognized. But in between that, we were on food stamps. We were on welfare. And it's another thing I love about this country, that we have this social safety net where you can come with whatever dreams you have from whatever country from around the world. And there's a certain foundation here, not just in terms of the institutions and the programs, but the individual citizens, either through churches, community centers, nonprofit groups, or whatever, that get together. The most recent example is how we banded together for the Syrian refugees and immigrants that are coming here because of the conflict they have. And we band together around these people and we create the conditions where if they want to work hard enough, they can create whatever life they want. And, there's parallels with that to the American, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, American dream kind of thing. I think it's a little less forgiving in the U.S., where it's really more...
You got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
You make it or you break it. And even if you fall back on their social safety net, it's nowhere near as generous. You have a couple of shots and then that's it. Whereas in Canada, I find it's much more generous, much more forgiving. And you can keep trying. And you don't necessarily have to go the more standard route. It's a kind of a stereotype sometimes. A lot of immigrants come here and what do their parents want them to be? Doctors, lawyers, engineers, the quote-unquote safe paths. But if you want to go on and become an entrepreneur, you can really do that here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of evidence of even, especially second-generation immigrants who have created incredible businesses. Some of my closest friends are people who... Well, we're all immigrants if you go far enough back.
Absolutely.
But particularly, I just love the passion that people who adopted this country have for it, like yourself.
Yeah, lately I've been living in the suburbs and nearby here in Kitchener, and we've got a kaleidoscope of a mosaic of people from India, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, what we refer to, I guess, in Quebec as like the old wool kind of immigrants to Canada, whatever. Everyone celebrates every holiday I've seen so far. People are celebrating Easter that, at least by looking at them, you wouldn't think these people are participating in Easter. Now, maybe they're not doing the Judeo-Christian aspects of it, but they're putting the stuff on their front lawn. They're clearly not from that, let's say, background of tradition, but they choose to participate in it. And on the inverse, the other day we were celebrating Diwali.
Yes.
And individuals that, on the face of them, you wouldn't think that they're from that background are choosing to just get involved in this as well. So we have these peoples coming from all over the place. They share their traditions. Some people decide to get involved with them, but they also choose to get involved with the traditions that are over here. And personally, I think we're all better for that.
Yeah. So what is it about that you love? I'm trying to dig down into like what is this? When you know a person, let's say when you get to know little details about them that nobody else does. For example, like you would know things about your wife that probably nobody else knows at this point. What is it? What is one of those things that you'd like to like bring to light about Canada that nobody else really knows, but is just a memory? I mean, I know you went to school in North Bay. You have a lot of love for North Bay. Talk about that part of Canada. What is that? What do you love about that?
If I had to pick between a place to live between, an urban area, which is where I've been for 10 years in downtown Ottawa, and a more rural area, I'd pick the rural area, hands down. I find it's much more intimate. People generally kind of know you, especially if you've been in the community after a while. 30,000, 100,000 people. People can still kind of stay connected, especially if you're also an engaged member of the community. And there's a certain willingness of people to go out there and put their necks on the line in order to help their neighbors. And also the relationship. There's a pretty big divergence now. Relationship to land, I find, is very different when you step outside of a city. You go to a place like North Bay, and in every season, people are engaged with the aspects, the elements of that season, whether it's going out in the bush to go hunting or to go skiing or cross-country skiing, or whether it's to enjoy time on the lake or to go out in the woods camping, all that kind of stuff. Even if someone's living in a fairly well-to-do life in the downtown of a North Bay kind of city or whatever, they're constantly going out into nature. And so whenever they come back to their homes and whatever businesses they're involved in or local government or whatever, they have that understanding of we have a relationship with the land around us. And of course, then it benefits even more when there's a nearby Indigenous community. I think that place, it's Nipissing First Nation. And for Aboriginal peoples, that's a really big part of their identity. So when that can get pulled even more into communities, and to some extent we have that in the major urban centers where now Indigenous peoples are becoming more empowered and they're bringing that to these city slickers, for lack of a better word. And they're kind of like, maybe it's not on the same level, especially if you've maybe had one or two generations where you're mostly in the city and you start to become a little disconnected from the land. But now through this Indigenous perspective, we're starting to see like, okay, well, no matter how far we advance technologically, economically, or whatever, we have to understand there's a relationship to where this prosperity is coming from, the ground upon which we are on, or the water that surrounds us. So that's to kind of start unpacking some of that. Those are the elements that I see that I really appreciate about areas like that and the people that are there.
I love that. I think it is Canada as a name comes from the Aboriginal world for this land.
Mm-hmm.
This is Canada. I love the relationship that so many Canadians have with the land, outdoor skating rinks, and their relationships with the seasons. Right? It's a rarer thing in maybe the more equatorial countries to have this relationship with the seasons, but here we have a relationship with fall. We have a relationship with winter. We know what it's like to watch the snow melt.
Yeah.
And we have this. One of the things I love about Ontario, as an Albertan, that I've come to love about Ontario is this relationship with water. Like particularly the Muskokas, the cottage living, the canoeing, the boating. We don't have water like that in Alberta, and it's just a unique and special feeling.
You got those beautiful mountains, though.
Yes, we do, which is that more than makes up for it in my opinion.
Yeah.
But, no, so I'd like to go into kind of another question I have for you is what could Canada be? What's the future?
I think there's three things that Canada could be. One, we can be an honest broker. I know that's been in kind of foreign policy for a long time, but I'll unpack that in a moment. Two, I believe we can be a trade facilitator. And three, I believe we can be a frontier explorer. So going to the first point, a honest broker. For a long time in kind of academia, intelligentsia, the Laurentian, whatever, the honest broker role was seen as kind of like, we're America's little brother, or this kind of like U.S. light kind of approach. And because of that privileged relationship, we can have these relations with other countries, whether it's the Russian bloc, the Asian bloc, or the European bloc or whatever, and bring people to the table and facilitate relationships and whatever. We've had now, I think, 2 attempts at trying to get a UN seat under 2 different types of government with 2 very different approaches. And the world doesn't care for what we're trying to offer.
No, it doesn't.
So this whole honest broker role, if we want to have that, we really need to rethink the way we engage the world. And grandstanding on particular, let's say, moral issues or let's say climate, economic related issues, whatever, isn't the way to go. That's not the way diplomacy runs. It usually the heart of diplomacy runs through commerce. So the U.S. is a really good example where for the 20th century, the majority of it, they were, especially once they became a leader after the Second World War, they were able to get their, let's say, soft moral suasion points or whatever on whether it's labor rights, human rights, or whatever. They were able to advance that agenda because on the other side of the table, they're pushing for commerce. They're making everyone more prosperous. They're opening up trade routes. They're safeguarding those trade routes with their military. And so when they say like, hey, we've made you all wealthier now, we'd also like you to consider adopting a couple of this stuff. People listen. But if you're just coming to the table, and we're a relatively small nation in terms of both GDP and consumer base, so if we're just coming to the table and saying like,
well, not necessarily in terms of GDP. We're quite a large nation, GDP wise, I would say.
fair, 1.3.
I think we're in the top 10, maybe 12.
trillion.
Like we're in the top 5%.
We produce a lot in terms of GDP, but we don't consume a lot, and that can make sense.
Yes,
on a
I agree with you.
Like obviously
Our
we have
consumptive power is not very large.
yeah. So yeah, thank you for correcting me on that. So in terms of the influence we bring to the table, notwithstanding our punching above the weight GDP, it's not the same as one of France or a UK or Germany. And now with the rise of the BRIC countries, even Russia, and it's now a diminished state, brings a lot to the table because they still have 145 million, 160 million people. Each human being that you add to a group of people raises the, let's say, influence or potential of that group exponentially. It's not linear. You know, two people aren't one person worth more, have one more person's potential than one person.
Right. No,
you put two people together,
exactly,
the synergy.
Value, yeah.
So for us, with our 37 million people, we're limited in that regard. Canada with, this, let's say, the same type of economy, whatever, but let's say with 50 million people or 100 million people, that's a completely different ballgame in terms of what we could be bringing to the table and other nations' willingness to listen to us. So to just take a step back, what I'm saying in terms of changing the way we're looking at the table and what we're bringing to the table, to go to the second point, trade facilitator, if climate change continues to be going the way it's going, the Northwest Passage continues to open, we have this incredible opportunity to leverage our position in the Arctic and the Northwest Passage, which is a much wider trade thoroughfare than the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
And the Panama Canal, you can expand it, of course, but
arguably infinitely wider.
Yeah. So the Panama Canal, it'll take billions of dollars to continually to expand it. And of course, the more traffic that goes through the air, the more polluted it's going to get, the more contested it's going to get. Whereas in the north, that's our land, that's our area. And there's a lot of space where ships can pass through, and we can significantly help other nations improve their commerce. So if we're coming to the table, whether it's on the Northwest or with respect to facilitating other trade-related relationships, we're trying to say, okay, our focus here is to help you guys make your respective people wealthier.
Right.
And in the process, you know, in the side committee rooms of all those various negotiations, we're going to talk about labor rights. We're going to talk about environmental standards. All that stuff's going to be covered, but our respective leaders aren't going to the forefront saying, like, this is the most important thing to Canada.
No, the most important thing is we want to help all of you help your citizens live better lives.
Exactly. And it's an economic statistical fact that as people get more prosperous, they will get more engaged in how their country's governing itself, both with respect to environmental standards, labor codes. Like if we really want countries like China or other places to adopt human rights and to continue advancing in that regard, our primary goal in that regard should be to make their citizens wealthier. And they'll take care of the regime itself.
Yeah, because like eventually they're going to be like, this corruption is costing us money. We don't want that.
Yeah, exactly. And already you see Chinese citizens getting more interested on the environmental question. You go back one decade or two, Beijing was an absolute smoghouse. And that's not to say that it's some kind of pristine wonderland now, but their own citizens are starting to push or to put pressure on their politicians, even though it's a one-state party and everything, to look into the environmental questions. And China is taking that seriously in their own way.
Well, they're definitely becoming world leaders in things like solar, even electric car manufacturing, nuclear. They are way ahead of us on nuclear. One of the guests we're going to be having on later is going to be talking about hydrogen and how Canada can lead in that. But I completely agree. Canada needs to be creating a wealthier world, and I think that's possible. A lot of people think that scarcity is the number one reality of economics, and I think I disagree. I think innovation is the number one characteristic.
What's that? That age-old Malthusian argument, right? Like eventually the population will get so big and we'll run out of food, and then there'll be calamity everywhere. But every time we approach some kind of scarcity, whether it's with respect to oil or food or whatever,
we innovate.
Necessity is the mother of innovation, and we always find some new technology, a new approach, a new process. Some great thinker comes along and they give us some fantastic gift, and all of a sudden we can feed an exponentially higher amount of people.
No, exactly. Okay, so essentially, I think this honest broker thing is great, and I love the trade facilitator. Tell me more about this final piece.
So the Frontier Explorer also touches on the previous point, the trade facilitator. All these points kind of cascade into one another. So the first part of the Frontier Explorer is the recognition that the world is hungry. All these developing countries that are now coming into their let's say their own kind of early developed state, whatever, they need a lot of resources. So we need to, it sounds kind of ironic, we need to continue exploring our own frontiers within our own country. We have an abundance of all kinds of natural resources. And the biggest thing that's holding us up now is we haven't really resolved the reconciliation question with respect to Indigenous peoples. And there's a big rule of law issue where we have no shortage of recent projects, whether it's oil and gas, mining related pipelines, where we cannot get them built because we don't have a clear rules-based process that says, look, if you want to try and create this is the timeline. These are the off-ramps you can take to legal action. Here's where you can appeal. Here's where you can appeal again. These are your options. Once they're exhausted, roughly it can take between X to Y period of time. There's incredible uncertainty. We can't exploit our own resources.
Which is funny because the Liberals pitched C-69 as an answer to that problem, right? Their argument, C-69 for the listeners who don't know, is a bill that was passed on environmental environmental legal reform for creating timeframes for these things, creating legal. But they changed a number of things that the Harper government had done, which actually put more uncertainty into the process and has essentially killed any major project. I mean, Paul Wells himself, and I wouldn't necessarily call him a conservative, came out in one of his articles and say we may become a big country that never built anything big again.
Yeah,
like that was the criticism of Bill C-69.
Well, can you imagine building the Trans-Canadian Railway in the modern age?
Oh, but the big part of this problem, and I think this is why this podcast has been established, and another reason that I wanted to have you on it is we live in a country that's all about the rule of law, right? We live in a country that claims to be a Western democracy, and yet we can't even figure out common law around this. We can't figure out a consensus, and I think that's a lack of imagination. I think no one's come up and said, actually, I think we can fix this problem. Often what we find with the reconciliation issue is that no one the status quo, the people who profit from the status quo continue to profit, and they're not actually interested in seeing better outcomes. And you know what? People are going to come after me and say, oh, of course we're interested in better outcomes, but let's look at the results of your behavior as opposed to your moralizing. Not you, obviously, but these people who are all about reconciliation. I think we'll come to the conclusion that they don't actually care.
Well, on that point, there's, I think, misrepresentation by our governments and the media with respect to where Indigenous people stand on project development, that kind of stuff. We're given this certain impression of, oh, well, all Indigenous peoples care about is safeguarding the land or the environment and that kind of stuff. They're always against these projects.
All development.
Right? Yeah, all development. That's not at all the case.
That's complete bullshit.
There's absolutely let's say, a group of Indigenous bands. There's, I think, 38 of them across the country where, let's say, environmental related issues, that's their priority. That's their number one issue. But there's also a whole suite of them. They're on the other, they're on the other end of the spectrum where for them, economic development is their biggest issue. And they have different, let's say, approaches to how they reconcile the two. But that's not what we hear from our leaders or from the media. We don't hear about these bans. Even the most recent one, the Coastal GasLink project, that was
hereditary chiefs came out against.
Well, exactly.
Where the elected chiefs were all in support.
And it's, of course, a very complicated issue because that's with respect to their internal governance.
Yes.
But what I found particularly interesting about that case, and it's a real shame COVID happened for many reasons. It's been a tragedy for many people, not just in Canada, but around the world. But I think for Canada specifically, I think we were so close to really addressing the reconciliation question because of what it was doing to our economy with respect to
we were seeing the blockades. Canada movement that was happening, and we were reaching a crisis point that could have been a catalyst for change.
Exactly. To benefit everyone on both sides of the aisle. and I don't mean like conservative liberal, I mean in terms of indigenous and non-indigenous, to recognize that, look, we're in this together, irrespective of the history that these dead old white men that aren't related to most Canadians today, irrespective of their decisions and their actions. We don't really wear that in terms of personal, individual accountability. But we're all still here, and we have a problem. So we have to work together to get through that.
Yeah, instead of dwelling on the past, let's chart a course for prosperity for everyone. I like this. So how do you see this explorer motif? I completely agree with you. We need to be exploring our potentiality as a nation. I think that's so important. But how do you see this explorer mentality? I want you to kind of frame it in the past, the present, and the future.
So the explorer mentality, let's say in the past, was about going out and identifying opportunities. So in many regards, the French explorers were more involved in Canada's early history than the British. The Brits were more involved in South and what is now the United States. So the French were sending expeditions out everywhere, trying to figure out which peoples inhabited these lands, what were the resources, what were the potential opportunities. And there's that constant communication, and the French explorers are really good at this, developing those relationships with the indigenous peoples throughout Canada, developing the relationships all the way back home in France, and creating that intermediary within New France, colonial France, Acadia. And to put that into the present, what we're trying to do, and Canada's, to some extent, I want to give it credit, is doing a great job in getting involved a little bit in all kinds of new technologies, whether it's AI, deep machine learning, electronic cars, even space-related technologies to a bit. And we're trying to put our fingers into all these pies and be a player, be at that table. The issue with it now, let's jump back into the past, and let's look at the founding of the New World. It wasn't just the French and the British that had a presence in North America. You also had the Dutch. The Dutch actually had a very large presence. You also had individuals from Italy, from Poland, from all kinds of other countries. Excuse me. They supplied individuals, laborers, technology, goods, services. Where are they now? In terms of who actually created the countries that became dominant on that continent, it was only the French and the British.
True.
So to now jump back into the present, start looking towards the future, especially, I know you eventually going to talk about space. Right. When we're looking at these new domains, whether it's outside of our planet or on our planet with respect to new technologies, new areas of commerce, if you don't have a physical presence, a large enough physical presence, it doesn't matter that you're participating. You won't have a seat at the table.
Market share, right?
Whether it's market share or, there's a lot of countries that don't necessarily have a market share, but they've embedded themselves as a prominent enough player that they're seen as the quote unquote honest broker for that particular subject.
Right.
And so they
can you give an example of that in like another country that's done something like that?
So with respect to space, because I'm most familiar in that area, you obviously have the Soviet Union and the U.S. that were large players in that regard. But
I guess China to some extent.
In the present, yes. In the past, not as much. So other countries that had a big influence on how the relevant international treaties and rules were drafted were, of course, the British and the French and a couple of other European member states, as well as Japan eventually. And to this day, many of those countries continue to have a very large role to play in the space sector, even though, respectively, their economies are no longer as large. Their relative population isn't as large as where it was back when they didn't have to compete with the Indias and the Chinas and the Brazils of the world.
Right. So how do you brought this up to me before, so I'm just going to ask, how did the UK approach the realization that they were losing market share in the space economy, and what did they do about it? And how do you see that as a framework that Canada could use to maybe establish ourselves in some of these futuristic industries as we look forward into the future?
Ambition. So in the UK's case, I think it was around 2010, where they looked at the landscape of the space sector. They projected where it was going to go, and just a couple of years ago, Morgan Stanley kind of pronounced on this as well. The 2017 state of the sector was $350 billion US. Morgan Stanley projects it to be about $1 trillion by 2040. So the UK was doing similar calculations back in 2010, and they decided, you know what, we have incredible aerospace heritage as the United Kingdom. going back.
RAF even,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly. So this has been an area we've been very prominent. We've been involved in various space programs. Why are we floundering? And it's not just in the sense of our market share, as if that's the be all and end all of things. Where are our satellites?
Why aren't we innovating?
Exactly. The U.S. is this is going back to when Boeing. I don't think SpaceX was maybe 2010ish was just around when SpaceX was coming around.
Started. It was because 2008 was I think their first successful launch. But,
so around 2010 was this area where we started seeing these entrepreneurial private companies stepping into all kinds of areas within the space sector. It wasn't. It was no longer this domain where it was just these big, large companies with specific and limited contracts with government. Now you're starting to have little companies that were doing their own kind of thing, getting involved in space and providing services to other private consumers. So the UK was kind of surveilling this environment and said, you know what, we want a bigger piece of this. It aligns with our let's say national narrative. It aligns with our history and our heritage. We see that this is going to be a huge part of the future. Like anyone who for your listeners, unless you're, let's say, living without a smartphone or without Wi-Fi, I believe the statistic something like you're interacting on average 37 times with a satellite on an average day. Yeah. In terms of the information that comes to your phone, to your GPS, to the services that are being provided to you, to financial to electronic banking, the weather, all kinds of things are influenced by data that's being either transmitted by satellites or being collected and then sent by satellites. So it plays a huge part in our economy and the technologies that we've been able to develop as a result of the space race back in the last century and the current, let's say, healthy competition between major powers in space. We as private citizens get the dividends of that. And GPS is one of the biggest examples that was given to us by NASA.
So what did the UK do? How did they realize they wanted a bigger piece of this pie? What were the steps?
They set out an ambitious framework with a specific clear goal. We want 10% market share by, I think it was within 10 years. So we're coming up on 10 years. Yeah, we're coming up on 10 years. And more importantly, they put their money where their mouth was. And they financially backed that investment. They assessed it and said, look, it's going to cost so many billions of pounds. We're going to put that behind this effort. So I was looking into it yesterday, and by their 2018 report, while the space sector as a whole has grown by 43% in this period, their national space sector has grown by 93%.
There you go, right? Doubling the sector growth. Yeah.
Now, with respect to their 10% goal, there's a lot of methodology that they employ.
Damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. At any point you're reading a report and a government says, look, we have this objective. And then they say, and according to this methodology.
we met that objective, yes.
So it's something about a currency appreciation and depreciation. Right. And if you stabilize the currency back to like $2006, they're at 8.1% of global share, but otherwise they're at 5.1 or whatever. Right. But the point is they're bigger now than they were before, and they're growing at a faster rate. And if we think about the mathematics, if you're doubling, even if the whole space sector, even if it goes up by a couple points, if it's a really large sector, that can be in the billions and billions of dollars. So even if yours only goes up by, let's say, even if a larger amount, twice the percentage, it may not be enough to keep your respective ratio. But who cares about what like this idea that the UK is going to get 10%? Okay, what if 9 other countries say we're going to get 10% too? So what, 10 countries are going to be involved? Like, it's not a zero-sum game.
So here's a criticism that I hear a lot about this industry. I want to go into how you see Canada exploring this industry more in a second, but one of the criticisms I often hear from, because as you know, I'm a big proponent of Canada being a space power.
Absolutely, as it should be.
Feeling that this is kind of our next step in evolution as a country, where we are explorers, as you pointed out. That I like to say, whether you come from the Philippines or the Punjab or Poland, you are an explorer if you're a Canadian.
Absolutely.
You literally did what 97% or something of all humans never do, which is leave where you were born. Right, and go somewhere new.
We are the 97%.
We are the 3%.
yeah, there you go. Sorry, yeah.
We're the descendant of the 3%. But a criticism I often get is that space is prohibitively expensive, and that a lot of the maybe monetization of space, let's say through space mining, is too far in the future to really care about. How do you respond to those criticisms?
When Christopher Columbus wanted to sail to India to create a faster route, I think he got rebuffed, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 times.
No one wanted to fund his...
Because it was too expensive.
Right.
You know, we already know how to get to India. We can already get these goods, whatever. It's like, yeah, maybe it's not the most expedient way and it costs, but whatever. Space is any kind of exploration is very similar in that regard. You need this crackpot, this wild enthusiast who's saying like, no, we can do this. And someone say, yeah, but we already have an analog. We already have this. And this is easy. This is here. This is convenient.
We can get it out of the dirt here. Like we can mine this stuff.
Exactly.
Why would we go up to space? Billions of dollars we'd be spending.
Exactly. And the let's say the explorer gene, if we're looking for a term, is in some individuals in our history and through all cultures and all times in history, where they're restless where they are. And maybe they're motivated by money, maybe they're motivated just for the thrill of going to an uncharted land or whatever. But there's something about that just draws individuals towards the unknown. And space
there's that quote from Moby Dick, right? I love to sail forgotten seas.
Yeah, I have an everlasting itch for shores remote. I yearn to sail forbidden seas.
Yeah, forbidden seas, right? Not forgotten. I love it.
Yeah, something like that. And space has been that ultimate final frontier for all of collective human history. You look to any culture or their religion's depiction of the heavens. We've been fascinated by what's up there. How far does it extend? I think one of the most quintessential human desires is to go beyond our limits, to go to where the gods are or gods were or what have you. So yeah, it's expensive. It takes a lot of money. But JFK said, look, we're going to put a man on the moon, and this is the time frame, and they did it. Now, they were in a context where they're competing against the Ruskies or the Soviets, and the Soviets were actually the first to put a human being into space itself.
Yes.
Didn't land on the moon; he just orbited the Earth. But there was a lot of pressure on the U.S. government at the time because if the Soviets beat us to the moon, communism wins. It's the better approach.
Zero-sum game.
As if that's how you can evaluate an ideology. Well, who can put a person on the moon first? That's clearly the ultimate qualifier, the ultimate measurement.
Yeah.
But we did it, and yes, it was the U.S. that put the individual there, but it wasn't just a U.S. Initiative. Obviously, Canada was in the background supporting NASA, as were many members of the what is now the European Union, as well as the UK, and that's where you start decreasing those costs through collaboration. This idea that any one country, whether Canada, the US, whatever, can just go it alone in space is ridiculous.
Humanity's got to go to space.
Exactly. Humanity needs to go to space. And it's one of the reasons why one of the biggest areas of cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union, now Russia, that doesn't really get a lot of attention, is on space. Well, we have all these squabbles going on down here on our very boring terrestrial plane. We have their cosmonauts and our astronauts up there in space, and they've been collaborating for decades.
They've been working together on the International Space Station for a long time.
Exactly, and they can coordinate on it. And it's not just what they're doing on the space station; it's also to get to the space station. So, for example, it was a bit of an embarrassing incident for Canada.
Yes.
We were going to put a RadarSat constellation up. We initially had plans to have the Americans launch it up, but we had a bit of a snafu with them concerning, I understand, some of the technologies that were on the satellites. So we found ourselves in a bind. India's launch schedule was really full. They're slammed because space has become a huge thing. There's launches going up every day. The U.S. just had a launch yesterday through SpaceX.
With 4 people on it.
4 people, yep. I think it's SpaceX's first manned.
Second.
Second.
The first one was only 2. Now we have 4 people going up.
Yeah. So to finish that story, eventually we came around to the Russians, and they were like, "Absolutely, we'll send your guys up." They charged us a hefty price, and it was a bit embarrassing because this was around the Crimea incident. So on one hand, our government is
condemning what they're doing,
and the other hand, they're going like,
"Here's a couple $1 billion to send our guys."
Well, not billion, but but we really needed those satellites up because they're part of our military, let's say, network for observation and threat detection. So we need those satellites up. There's a pressing national interest, but it goes to the point: what else can Canada be doing? We definitely need to develop launch capacity.
Yeah, 100%.
And that goes back to the previous point that I was making, that if you don't have a physical presence in this frontier, it doesn't matter if we're talking about space or artificial intelligence, whatever, if you don't have a very heavy seat at that table, like a thick wooden chair that's difficult to rest away, you are not going to have a voice for very long. You will maybe be a proxy for someone else to leverage you sometimes to kind of diffuse their own positions through what's seen as like a more neutral a mouthpiece or whatever. But it's going to be very difficult for you to drive your agenda. And that's what I was talking about. Those previous peoples that were involved in the exploration and setup of the New World. You don't have a Dutch country here in North America, or a Polish country or an Italian country.
They ended up not having a seat to the table.
Exactly. They sent their people over here, but they didn't have a government presence. The Dutch did for a while, and that was Lower Manhattan, and they lost. But that gets to the real politic of how these new frontiers are going to go. Any of these new technologies, any of these new physical domains like outer space. It's not enough for us to have Canadian technology aboard an American satellite. It's not enough that in the Lunar Gateway mission that they're going to be using like Canadarm3 or whatever, like some version of that Canadarm technology on that installation.
It's
like
a lack of ambition.
We need our women and men, whether it's on the moon, on whatever kinds of missions, like we need a physical presence. And it can't just be as we're providing support to an American mission or to an EU mission or whatever. Eventually, we got to get to the point where the news isn't saying Canada's partnering with the US or with NASA or with JAXA or with the European Union. It should be they're partnering with us on this one.
Yes.
And that's where we need to get to the point that we figure out, okay, here are areas where there are gaps in whatever the frontier is, whatever the economy of that frontier is. Here's where we want to be leaders. Here's where we want the best and brightest around the world to be partnering with us instead of the way around.
And you know what? Taiwan has figured this out. Japan figured it out.
Luxembourg has figured it out.
Freaking Singapore is figuring it out, right?
So this idea that, to kind of contrast my earlier point, we're, a small country in terms of population. It's difficult to influence when you only have 37 million. Not if those are a very concentrated, very ambitious and motivated 37 million people with the right government funding back, putting money where their mouths are. And that's what the UK did right. Like, it doesn't matter if they never reach that 10% goal. And frankly, that's a huge ambition, given that there's so many other spacefaring nations. Back in, I think it was the 1980s or 1990s, there were some 15 or so spacefaring nations. Now there's nearly 60.
Right.
And that number is increasing. That's a big issue for Canada. And if you look at the stuff that comes from both the current government and previous government, it always starts off with like, we're the third nation in space. Fantastic. In like 1957 or 58, we've been resting on and this has been a common criticism within the space sector of government policy, and whether it was blue policy or red policy.
The Emerson report, right? How embarrassing.
But 2012, it was released, and we've had this big issue in Canada where we've been resting on our laurels. This goes back to 2003. 2003, we kind of set up the Canadian Space Agency with $300 million a year base funding, a bunch of long-term projects, and by the time the Conservative government in 2006 came in charge, they said, okay, now we need a long-term strategy. So they charged the Canadian Space Agency, the CSA, with creating that strategy. By the time the CSA came back, the 2007 recession hit. And so the government of the day looked at the bill of that. It's like, look, this may be good stuff. Wrong time. We are all going broke. And they buried that. And for basically up until last year, there was no long-term strategy in place. And what the commercial sector was saying, look, we need two big pieces. We need a long-term strategy. So that companies in Canada, or those that are looking to possibly come into Canada, know where government's going to go. Space is one of those sectors where if you don't have very strong, active, and persistent government support, it's not going anywhere.
It's the Hudson's Bay model. It's the East India Company.
Yeah, exactly.
For exploration, you can't have companies that are relying because the costs are unknown. You can't calculate
You can start
a
a small sat space company for a couple $1 million.
Right.
That's the scale of the technology now. But if you're looking at setting up the large companies that are going to be the ones procuring the satellites and the technologies for it, you need government behind you.
Yeah.
SpaceX is a good example where people have a certain impression of, look at this fantastic entrepreneurial. They made themselves
kind of things. Spending.
It's all government contracts, yeah. and that's how it works in major industries. And it's not a feature of capitalism or market controlled economies. Whenever you're involved in heavy industry, especially heavy industry that's open to competition on the global market, you either have your government behind you, or you're not involved in that industry.
Every single government in the world subsidizes in some way their agricultural sector.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's like the sectors that we care about, we protect.
Yeah, absolutely correct. So going back to the space sector, we haven't had that protection, not protection, but haven't had that focused, long-term, predictable investment. We've had big chunks here and there, whether it's for the RADARSAT program or for the James Webb Telescope or the OSIRIS-REx mission. That only gets industry involved to the extent they're like, okay, we're going to involve these resources. Exactly, for this period.
It's not a long-term strategy, yeah.
But they're also looking at other countries. So to give a good example, while the UK was being ambitious and we were kind of floundering, new government comes in, old government goes out, and everyone's kind of like, yeah, we're going to get on this. Companies look at the results. Where's the money? Fine, put the money aside. Where's the plan?
Yeah, there's no plan.
No plan. And so what did some of the largest companies that are operating in Canada do?
Canada.
They started shipping their stuff over to the UK. Where they saw there's a clear plan, clear funding. It's a very competitive, very cutthroat industry. So if you're going to do the same activity, why not do it in an area where at least you have support from a government?
Yeah, exactly. No, I love this. We're going to have more of these episodes because I try to keep it to about 45 minutes, and we've almost already got there. But I love it. A land of explorers, honest broker, promoting trade. These are really positive. And a land that can provide a safe place for the world's tormented almost. The people who have not, like your family, who've been moving every generation for the last 3 and hopefully won't have to anymore.
Yeah, it's I haven't come across too many Canadians, whether they're, current generation or many generations old, where they just kind of came here for an even better life.
Right.
Like I rarely, unless they were unifying with the rest of their family, like maybe from their states or whatever, and they were kind of had family here. So just, let's kind of get all closer together, which of course there are people like that. But for the most part, it's some kind of story of, I was in this place and I wanted a better life for myself. And not like, I had this kind of phone and I wanted to upgrade to the latest iPhone. It was, I didn't have a phone.
Right.
I didn't have a predictable income. I had no guarantee that my children would have a better life than myself.
And I was told there was a country that I could go to where if I worked hard, I could change my stars.
Exactly. That's what Canada is. And as an ending point, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, what is it that I would want to pull out and distinguish for people about Canada? One of the things we often get criticized for is like, oh, we're just like America, but we're a bit nicer. And, we're a humble people for the most part, and I don't think, give ourselves enough credit. We're very different from the U.S., I would argue. To go to the first point that I made about civic identity, in the U.S., it wasn't about using a certain framework, even though it's very similar to institutions and similar, let's say, influential religions at the beginning of that country's inception.
I guess the philosophies of the day were similar. We got the Thomas Paines and a lot of the thinkers that established America were British.
Yeah, but the big difference between them and us is they had the melting pot approach, and specifically, what the melting pot means is they're trying to create a new ethnic identity. They want Americans. Like, you can come here as Chinese, Irish, Italian, like they didn't care. But when you come here, you're an American. An American means that you are an American, whatever that means in their kind of mythological ethos, narrative, whatever. But that's how they see themselves. They're an American with heritage from X. Whereas it was very different in Canada. It was, you are whatever you are within this framework, within this civic identity. So you bring the best of whatever you're coming from, and you don't give that up, whether you're French, English, Indigenous.
And we didn't ask them to, right?
And we didn't ask them to. It was just simply like, look, these are our institutions. Here's what we value. We value openness, transparency, honesty, the rule of law, accountability. And we believe that we can take whatever background you're from, and we can and you can put that into this framework, and we can prosper. And you can continue living your life, thinking your ideas, practicing your virtues, obviously to certain extents. And we can just get along.
Yeah, harmony. I like to say diversity isn't our strength. Harmony is.
Exactly. Diversity in that regard is we're bringing different things to the table, but we're still using, or we should be still using the same institutions, because it was those institutions and those philosophies that created a nation where you can bring all these people together and not have them at each other's throats. Oftentimes we have cultures here that when you go back to their home, they are in a very disagreeable position with someone on the other side of the border.
Yeah.
But they come here and, there's some of that. But for the most part, people just kind of understand, like, look, if I don't like certain people, I'm just not going to hang out with them.
Yeah.
I'm just going to do my thing. I'll set up my own my own community. I'll have that, and I'll start integrating with the other community here. And there's no pressure for people to be like, no. You need to be a Canadian first and only a Canadian. And sometimes you can have Chinese New Year. There's never been
and
that
Diwali,
sentiment.
like you pointed out.
Yeah,
I mean,
Diwali.
I'm probably as white as they come, right? My family's been here a long time, but on Diwali, I ordered Indian food because I love Indian food.
Absolutely.
What a gift that our country. It's just easy for me to get really good Indian food. Yeah, I love these thoughts. We're definitely going to be talking about them more in the future. But give me one sentence, 2 sentences, why you love Canada, and then just one maybe really succinct. How can the future be brighter?
I love Canada because I can be free here as anybody else. And we're all encouraged to be free. For the second point, what Canada can be?
Yeah, well, one, just like give us a lodestar to march toward.
I mean, this might sound a little bit hallmarky, but I really think Canada can be the heart of the world. And both in the sense of its geographic position. If we look at the atlas or the globe in a certain way, we're kind of the middle of everyone.
Right.
If you have North America on the left, then
but if we got the Pacific Ocean on one side,
we're the only
Atlantic,
country that's on the Pacific, the Atlantic, and
the Arctic.
Arctic.
Yeah.
Russia's not on the Atlantic.
No,
people forget that. The U.S. isn't on the Arctic. So we have.
Well, they've got. I guess they have.
Well, yeah, sorry, I completely spoke. They have Alaska, yeah. But in terms of where the Northwest Passage is, that's where I was thinking in my mind.
Right,
that's ours. Let's be very clear with respect to Americans. That's ours, and we need to have a government that is unabashedly like, no,
this is ours.
This is ours. But on that point, our location alone allows us to have meaningful conversations with China, with Russia, with Europe, with America, and through the NAFTA agreement with Latin America because of the interest that go there to Mexico.
We've got Africa right there too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are, and to some extent, I really think that it can help us that the U.S. since the 2007 recession has been going in a direction of being more and more internal looking, isolationist in the sense of like they finally realize like we're being stretched thin. Other people aren't pulling their share, at least based on the 20th century models. We're not energy independent, and decided to go in a very different approach. And there's been criticism of the last couple of years. Oh, but Trump's been doing this to us, and he's like, so was Obama, so was Bush. Like this has been a long-term trend, and irrespective of who wins the next election, the election after that, whatever, it's unlikely to.
I think they're going to be looking inward for a lot longer.
Yeah, and it provides us as Canadians with the opportunity to recognize, like, look, we can't rely on the U.S. anymore. Doesn't mean we can't be great allies and be collaborators and continue to profit from continued trade, but that also finally we need to kind of start growing up.
Yeah,
and recognize that
time to move out of our parents' house.
Exactly. We can no longer take our defense for granted. That's not I don't want to be suggesting that the U.S. is going to be marching across the border or anything, but in the sense of we need to be responsible and accountable for our security, for our commercial prosperity, for our positions on the world stage. Because the more they diverge towards their own interests, we're clearly seeing a divide on things such as environmental issues, the biggest one, where it doesn't matter if you're conservative, liberal, whatever, we see it a different way, and that's a priority for us. Not so much for the Americans. If we really want to push those narratives, we need to create the institutions, both in the public and private sectors, that allow us to advance those positions.
Yes.
So we, in that regard, I guess we
need to take the training wheels off.
Yeah, exactly. We need to take training wheels off. We need to grow up, and we have that potential there. Like if we can get to that point, we are in an incredible position with respect to where geopolitics and trade is going to go in the next 20 to 50 years or whatever, to reach across the aisle to all these different and very, very different partners and have them put trust in us to at least be the convener. Yeah. And I'll leave it as like a final point. It's also related to space. Just the other month, something called the Artemis Accords was signed onto by Canada. It's not an international treaty. It's a set of principles that basically the U.S. advanced with respect to how we're going to continue commercially developing the outer space and how space agencies are going to play a role. Japan signed on, the UK, Luxembourg, and a bunch of other countries. That could have been a role for Canada.
Right.
You don't need launch capacity. You don't need to put the first person on the moon to be able to say, look, we have these international treaties from the 60s. They're outdated. The Soviet Union no longer exists.
Right.
We all have a clear and immediate interest in outer space. We don't need to make a treaty today. We don't need to set binding international law.
Principles. We need principles.
Exactly. Canada could have done that.
Yeah. Well, we didn't.
We didn't. And once again, we've partnered on to someone else's framework.
Yeah, I loved it. Let's get ambitious about what Canada can be.
Clear,
thank you very much,
Clear, ambitious
Andrej.
goals.
Really appreciated having you here.
Thank you, David. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.